Good evening. This is Reader Ryan Paul Winter. This will be a second in a series on the Ladder of Divine Ascent by St. John Climacus. And last week we had an opportunity to look at several things concerning the ladder. First of all, we looked at the icon for the Ladder of Divine Ascent, and you'll remember that there were 30 steps on that icon of the ladder. And those 30 steps are referred to as heaven scaling steps of a ladder. It corresponds to the 30 years of our Lord's earthly life. The virtues themselves are considered to be heaven scaling steps on this ladder, which is scales to heaven, scales to Christ himself. Likewise, that's contrasted with the vices, which are compared not with steps on a ladder, but links on a chain. The vices are links on a chain, and the chains are that which draws us down into Hades, into death, into hell. Last week we also had a chance to look at the life of St. John, and we saw that this book, The Ladder of Divine Ascent, was written at the request of another abbot. St. John was at the end of his life the abbot of Mount Sinai Monastery. At that time was known as the Monastery of the Transfiguration. It's now known as the Monastery of St. Catherine. And the book, The Ladder of Divine Ascent, was written in request of St. John, I'm not sure if he was a saint or not. John of Riathu, who was the abbot of a monastery a little bit north and west on the Sinai Peninsula. We also looked at the three states of the monastic life, the three different kinds of monasticism. For review, who can tell me what one of those three states of the monastic life is? Zoe's smiling. Tell me one of them, Zoe. Say again?
Solitary.
The solitary life, that's correct. What's another one? The skeet life, and the third is? Cenobitic or communal monastery. So Cenobitic communal monks live together. They're in obedience to one spiritual father. An average size would probably be 20. Some of them are even as high as 500. Then there's the solitaries who live by themselves completely. Sometimes they'll have one or two disciples with them, but the point of a solitary is to be alone and to pray with God. And then the skeet is kind of halfway in between that. The skeet is 2 or 3 like-minded brothers, and it avoids the dangers of the solitary life, because when you're solitary, you are in danger of falling into delusion. It's dangerous to be by yourself and just totally engage in prayer, because you can fall into demonic delusion. And so you have to be very experienced in the spiritual life before you go and be a solitary. So a skeet life with 2 or 3 brothers avoids that, because you've got a couple other people to kind of keep you in check. But at the same time, because it's only 2 or 3 and you're like-minded, you can put a lot of effort into what a solitary would, namely prayer, contemplation. So again, a skeet life is still is going to require a higher state of spirituality, because you need to be with 2 or 3 like-minded brothers who all are ready for kind of a higher spiritual practice of, and that's the next thing we looked at, of the divine vision. So remember last week we talked about these 2 stages of the spiritual life. Again, it's not like you end one and begin the other, but the one that needs to come first is the state of action, praktiki. It's also known as cultivating the virtues, keeping the commandments, keeping the gospel commandments. And then only after we've done that for some period of time, years, decades, then we slowly become ready to move further into the state of divine vision, theoria. And theoria, again, is not theory. It's actually very practical in one sense, but it's practical in the sense of seeing the vision of God, beholding the divine light, having the divine fire abide within you. And again, it's not that those who are the beginners in the spiritual life don't pray at all. That's not the point. But the point is that a illumination of seeing the vision of God, which is the goal of spiritual life, correct? The goal of spiritual life is to arrive in heaven, be saved, be sanctified, be free from the passions, see the vision of God. Well, we can begin to experience that even here on earth, and that's what the divine vision, the theoria, is talking about. It's talking about already experiencing heaven here on earth now. And the point is that we need a lot of struggle. That's why this life is given to us. We need a lot of struggle, ascetic action, ascetic purification, keeping the commandments before we can move on, properly speaking, to that state of vision. Okay, I'll pause at this point and ask if there are any questions or comments on that review of what we talked about last week. Okay. So at this point, what I want to do is I want to look at a passage from, What I want to do is I want to talk about books, practically speaking, first of all. I'm going to pull out a few books and tell you a little bit about them. There are 2 editions of the Ladder of Divine Ascent. There's actually, I think, a third one way back when, but anyway, there are 2 editions now that we have around. One is this version by Holy Transfiguration Monastery, blue one, hardback, very nice. They just came out with a reprinting of this that's a slightly bigger book that is typeset a little bit differently. There probably are minor changes in the translation, but it's going to be basically the same thing. I paged through it really quickly. I haven't had a chance to examine it closely, but I paged through it really quickly a few weeks ago, and it's basically the same book. It's just a different typeset. There's also a version from the Classics of Western Spirituality series. It's interesting, the Classics of Western Spirituality. It seems like kind of a backwards name to me, because as opposed to Buddhism, I guess. I don't know. But anyway, I would consider John Eastern. But John Climacus, The Ladder of Divine Ascent. This book, I have a couple problems with it. One, if you read through it, the paragraphs within each step are not numbered, whereas they are in Holy Transfigurations. So if you want to find the passage that someone is quoting, by the way, the ones that are almost always quoted are from this Holy Transfiguration. That just seems to be the one that everybody quotes from. Then it's harder to find it within this version by the Western classics. Also, I just think there are little things that I think this translation is just a little bit better from the Holy Transfiguration version. And finally, there is one part of it that really is totally missing. There's a section called To the Shepherd at the end. It's not a step itself, but it's an extra epilogue at the end. It's called To the Shepherd, and it's basically a writing to spiritual fathers as to how they can help their spiritual children apply what's being read in this book. That's totally missing from this Classics of Western Spirituality version. However, there is value to this Classics. I don't want to poo-poo on this one totally, but the Classics of Western Spirituality version has something really, really good in it, namely the introduction by Bishop Callistus Ware. It's just fantastic. It's excellent. I bought this version not because I wanted to read the letter in it, but because I wanted the introduction by Bishop Callistus Ware. This hardcover version from Holy Transfiguration Monastery is a little bit more expensive, but it's hardcover and it's printed on acid-free paper, and they always make books that they intend to last 100 years, so it's worth it. I think Father's going to look for possibly buying it for folks. The other book I want to talk about at this point, because I'm going to look at some passages from it here in a minute, is The Arena by St. Ignatius Branchaninov. This is an older version here in my right hand that is just pretty much hideous in its typesetting. There's just no other way to put it. It's really ugly to look at. I mean, I'm not kidding you. The print is like crooked in some places. It's really bad. So they took the same text and they've now retypeset it, thank God. I think this is the only version that's available anymore. If you're trying to buy a used version, don't buy this one. It's just hideous to look at. I'm serious. Buy this one, okay? Buy this newer version that just came out. It's from the same people, Holy Trinity in Jordanville. You have to give these monks in Holy Trinity in Jordanville some credit, though. What they were doing originally is they were doing their handwork by hand typesetting these books, and so it just it's nice and kind of quaint. I guess if you like quaint, oh, they said it by hand kind of stuff, then you'd like this version. But just get this one, okay? It's the same text. Two other things I want to talk about are the company, the Orthodox Christian Recorded Books, which is run by a priest in Maine, I think. They've done a recording of the latter Divine Ascent. Again, the Holy Transfiguration Monastery version, another reason to buy that one. They've done a recording of it on 8 CDs, and I would highly recommend this. His pronunciation of a few words is not the way I would pronounce the words. I'm pretty sure it's the priest, whose name has escaped me at the moment, who's reading this. And he's done a great service by recording it for us. His pronunciation of a few words is a little not the way I would say them. One more thing I want to say is the Philokalia, which we're going to talk about in a minute, is a rather advanced book in general. But at the end of the Philokalia, there is a glossary of terms that are often used in spiritual literature. This glossary, again, which I think is a work of Bishop Callistus Ware, is absolutely fantastic. So if nothing else, just borrow this book from the library and photocopy out this 20-page glossary and just have it, so you know what these words mean, because they're technical words, such as the ones I was just trying to explain. Action and vision. If you don't understand what these technical words mean, action, vision, and a few other things that it talks about in there, you're going to be confused by what say in spiritual literature. So try to get that and just make reference to that, have it at your side. Okay, now what I want to do is I want to look at a passage from St. Ignatius, branching off in the Ladder. He's constantly quoting, in the Arena. This is St. Ignatius branching off wrote the Arena. And in the Arena, he's constantly quoting the Ladder. Oftentimes has long passages from the Ladder. And what he's trying to do here is he's trying to teach young monks of his day and time how to apply the writings of the spiritual fathers, which is exactly the question I want to talk about today. And he has 2 chapters in particular, chapter 9 and chapter 10, that address this question. And so I just want to walk through his answers to these 2 questions. First of all, what spiritual books should we read is what he talks about in chapter 9. And then secondly, in chapter 10, he talks about how to read those spiritual books. So chapter 9, the first thing he says is that we need to focus on the gospel. And of course, by extension, also the epistles and the Old Testament. But he makes a great deal of the fact that the life of a monastic is a life that is in obedience to the Gospels. And really that could be extended to our lives. One way to define a Christian is one who keeps the Gospel commandments. Plain and simple. If we don't follow the commandments of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, I don't know how we can call ourselves Christians. And secondly, maybe if we haven't even read the gospel very much, maybe we don't even know what the gospel commandments are. I mean, we've got to be honest about our spiritual condition and maybe even our ignorance. If we haven't read the gospel in its entirety, if we haven't read the gospel many times over, because you don't always get everything the first time you read something. It doesn't always make sense to you, and you understand more and more as you reread it. The Gospels and also the epistles in the Old Testament need to be our constant reading, what we read from the most. And that has to be the beginning of our spiritual reading before we can even really move on to something else. That all these other spiritual writings can really be considered commentaries on the gospel, extensions of the gospel. Here's more thoughts about how we keep the gospel. St. Ignatius also mentions a book that thankfully is now in existence in English, and that is the Gospel Commentaries by Theophylact, who's an Archbishop of Bulgaria. I would highly recommend those. He also, basically what he's done there is he's taking the writings of spiritual writings, commentary writings of saints who've gone before him. In particular, he focuses on St. John Chrysostom, but it's a distillation of those who've commented on the scriptures before. And the nice thing about it is that it's penetrating, it's insightful, and it's short. Okay, you look at one verse. His comments on one verse, and it's usually just a paragraph or two. So you can read it and you can get the sense really quickly of the main point. And think about the favor that he's done to us, because he had to have read pages and pages and works of spiritual fathers of the past to get it down to this one paragraph that's the meat of the matter for the gospel commentary. Now it has also been released, I believe it's Galatians, and forget what the other one is. I think there's just a new one that's just come out. Anyway, they're starting to they're working on translating the commentaries on the epistles as well. I'm not sure if the Old Testament exists or not, and we'll see. But I assume that those are going to be of equal quality with the Gospels. St. Ignatius says this is what you need to have at your side when you're reading the Gospel so you can properly understand it. And thankfully that now exists in English. St. Ignatius also mentions the works of someone who was had just been made a saint in the time of St. Ignatius. That's St. Tikhon of Voronezh. I don't know as we have any of those available in English, but I think we can still take something away from that, namely that saints who are close to us in time maybe are going to be a little bit easier for us to apply to ourselves, because their situation is going to be a little bit more contemporary to us. And I think that's an important principle. And we have some similar folks who are close to us. I think there's various elders, Elder Cleopa, Elder Paisius, some others. And those are going to be of value to us because they're more familiar with our contemporary situation. I'll mention a few more that I would highly recommend in just a minute. But I want to finish with the list that St. Ignatius gives to us. So he says, first of all, books written for Cenobitic monks should be read, such as, and then he gives a list. So when he says books written for Cenobitic monks, what he's talking about is books that focus on the active life. Focus on keeping the commandments. Focus on cultivating the virtues. And that is corresponding to books that are for Cenobitic monks, because that communal monks, because that's their task, is to be beginners in the spiritual life. So whenever you see a book referred to as this is an active book, is sometimes what they'll say, or this is a book for Cenobitics or communal monks, then those two things really are basically equivalent ways of talking, that this is books for people who are beginning in the spiritual life. Here's the list he gives. I'll find some way to post this list when I post the talks, okay? So you can just listen. But he gives the following books. He says the Instructions by St. Dorotheus. That exists in English. I know that. There are some sermons by St. Theodore the Studite, which to my knowledge, do not exist in English, unfortunately. He says the Questions and Answers by St. John and Barsanuphius. He actually says that you should only read the ones from answer 216, is what he says. Unfortunately, I don't think our English versions, which do exist now, are numbered the same way. I tried to identify which number 216 he was talking about. I wasn't able to do it. I think maybe ours are maybe even in a completely different order than the Sylvanic version he must have been looking at. So unfortunately that doesn't help us. But the Questions and Answers by St. John of Barsanuphius I think are still highly recommended. He also lists the Ladder by St. John. He lists the works of St. Ephraim the Syrian. which I would highly recommend. In particular, there's a book called The Spiritual Psalter, which was compiled by St. Theophan the Recluse, and it's kind of a distillation of some of the works of St. Ephraim the Syrian. Again, this is the same saint who wrote for us our great Litten prayer. O Lord, Master my life, take from the spirit of sloth, despair, lust of power, and idle talk. St. Ephraim the Syrian is sometimes referred to as the weeping saint. I mean, if you want to read something that really inspires you to contrition and humility and weeping for your sins, but not in a way that produces despair. That's what's amazing about him. It's not in a way that produces despair. The point is, and this is actually what St. John talks about in step 6 in the ladder, joy-making mourning. So it's a weeping that produces joy because it's a weeping over your sins and that which separates you from God. And so it's the beginning of the spiritual life. In a sense, it's the beginning of dealing with your sins. So the point is that the saint who teaches us joy-making mourning is St. Ephraim the Syrian, and the spiritual Psalter is highly recommended in that regard. Also, highly recommended is the book that Father has there, the Institutes and Conferences of St. John Cashion. That was a book that was basically the summary of Eastern monasticism for folks in the West. But it's a little bit longer, but it's very good. Some books that I would want to add to this list, not to presume myself equal to St. Ignatius, but I think books that if I said them to St. Ignatius, he would agree belong on the list, I hope. But books I would add would be The Sayings of the Desert Fathers. And there's also a similar book called The Paradise of the Holy Fathers. And a lot of the content between those two is overlapping. Also, The Paradise of the Holy Fathers is out of print. It's difficult to find. There actually is a special company that reprints old out-of-print books at great cost, I will add. But that you can obtain a copy of The Paradise of the Holy Fathers. But if you get a copy of The Sayings of the Desert Fathers, which is not very expensive and is a really nice collection, most of what's in The Paradise you'll actually have. There's also the Saints' Lives. Father read from those tonight. The versions of the Saints' Lives that I'm most familiar with are the prologue, which is kind of a shorter version of the Saints' Lives. And then also there's a longer version that's actually made by the same people who do the Gospel commentaries by St. Theophylact. And they're working on translating the whole set. They're up to 7 now, up to April. This is the St. Dimitri of Rostov, the great collection of the lives of the saints. These are a little bit. What were we going to say?
What month are they up to, Ryan?
They're up to April. They're up to April. Yeah. They're up to number 7. I think they're focusing more on St. Theophylact at this point.
For the record, most of those lives are on OCA.org.
That's right.
Most of those are from St. Dimitri of Rostov.
That's right. The ones on OCA.org, and there's also a set of them on Holy Trinity. Holy Trinity Church in Baltimore, Maryland, has a calendar that goes by the old calendar, but you can still find an extensive list. It's the most extensive list I know of for the saints of every day. And many of them you can click on links that are a version of the Saints' Life that are very close to the ones on the OCA. So there's another place you can find some. And there is a prologue online too. That's correct. So all those can be found online. Of course, I hope St. Ignatius would be complimented by me adding the arena itself to this ladder, to this list of books for beginners. I would also add the Optina Elders. I would really highly recommend the Optina Elders to you. These are a set of elders who were from Optina Monastery in Russia a couple centuries ago. The last of them died out just before the Russian Revolution. It was a chain of 14 different elders. There's a whole series of, it doesn't have all 14 of them, but it's 6 or 7 of them, and they're an extensive version of the particular elder's life. You can find that. You can also find a book that was translated by Bishop George from Holy Cross Monastery called Living Without Hypocrisy. It was a set of sayings of the Optina Elders. I would highly recommend that book as well. The nice thing about the Optina Elders is they are close enough to us in time that they have a much better understanding of the challenges of modern man. If you read them, you feel like this is somebody who understands modern problems. Maybe they don't understand the extra problems of technology, of course, because technology, Facebook, that kind of thing didn't exist then. But other than that, the problems of modernity, the Optina Elders understand. Finally, I would add the works of St. Theophan of Reclus. He also has a way of stating things very clearly. And then finally, I would add The Way of the Pilgrim, which is a book that recounts the journeys of a holy fool for Christ and his beginnings in the Jesus Prayer. Okay, let me pause and ask if there are any questions or comments at this point. Okay. What were you going to say something, Audrey?
I can wait till the end, actually. It's not like pertaining to this section.
Okay. And then St. Ignatius then goes on to give a list that he says is for more advanced monks. He says these are books that are written for solitaries, and after you've spent some considerable time in the monastic life, he says, then these are books that you could turn to and become acquainted with when you've got some experience and some discrimination in the spiritual life. Very quickly, I'll just list them. The Philokalia. Unfortunately, he was probably dealing with a different version of the Philokalia that had a different set of works than the 5-volume one that we have. The problem with Philokalia is the works in it it's a collection of 20-some saints, I think. And the works in it are of different places. Some of them are very much beginner works, and some of them are these highly advanced spiritual treatises that just, you read them and you're like, your head spins. You can't even hardly understand what's being said, to be honest. And some of them maybe don't make your head spin when you read them, but they're probably about topics that we as beginners maybe should pass over at this time. So in general, that's why I would say I think it would be best to read other things before you read the Philokalia.
If I could add a parenthesis, Ryan.
Yes.
In Russian, the word Philokalia is dobrotolubia.
Yes.
And that's a whole different set of things than that. The Greek
Yes.
one and the Russian one don't all.
The Greek one and the Russian one are quite a bit different.
The Russian one's very short.
And I think the Russian one is quite a bit shorter, and I think it's just a different editorial process that went into it. So our version of the Philokalia, the point is that I think in general there's a great deal of discrimination that needs to go into reading this book. I'm not saying that
There's plenty of good books.
you couldn't. There's plenty of other books to read that I think could help you just as much. That's the point. So I wouldn't pick up the Philokalia without consulting your spiritual father first, is what I would say. He also lists some other books: Skate Patrology, St. Isaac the Solitary, St. Isaac the Syrian, which we have a really nice version of St. Isaiah the Syrian now. Isaac the Syrian. St. Isaac the Syrian. We have a really nice version of his sermons. I think I would say the same thing about that as well as the Philokalia. It's a rather advanced book. Again, I would probably not pick it up without consulting your spiritual father first.
But not nearly as much hesitance about that as the Philokalia.
No, you're right.
I'm reading it right now.
It is. It's a wonderful book, but what you've got to understand, and I'll come to this question more in a minute, is you've got to understand that St. Isaac the Syrian is addressing solitaries. And he's addressing questions that are specific to maintaining a contemplative life 24/7. In other words, someone who sits in their cell and prays and reads the Scripture and says the hours, and that's all they do, 24 hours a day. So that's the situation he's addressing. And so some of the problems that he's talking about there really aren't problems that apply to us, is the point. Anyway, he lists some other writers, St. Mark the ascetic, St. Simeon the new theologian. Again, these are all writers that are only available to us in the Philokalia. So that's just another reason why I would say the Philokalia is something to save for later. So, to summarize this, what I would want to say is that there are 4 kinds of books in the spiritual life, which can be listed as followed. And there's some overlap between these. But the 4 kinds of books are as follows. Books that focus on the active life, the cultivation of the virtues. Books that focus on the contemplative life, that is, the life of divine vision and prayer. Books that focus on dogmatic issues, dogmatic theology. In other words, you could think of that, generally speaking, as the Nicene Creed and what the Nicene Creed means, what was taught authoritatively by the fathers at the 7 ecumenical councils. There's a need for that kind of book. And then finally, the 4th kind is sort of a speculative theology. It's not nearly as common in Orthodox theology as it is, say, in Protestantism. But speculative theology, let me start at the end and work my way back. Speculative theology, I think, in general, doesn't do much to help us for our spiritual lives. Hardly at all. It's the whole point. It's speculative. And I think in general, I think we can for the most part avoid them.
Can you give an example?
An example of the speculative, mostly what I could give would be examples from Protestantism, but a few things I would maybe say would be something that treats at length the aerial toll houses and gives a whole lot of details about the aerial toll houses. If you don't know what I'm talking about, then don't even worry about it, okay? But maybe some other things that maybe wouldn't exactly be called speculative, but some book that goes on at great length about the controversy between the new calendar and the old calendar and why you should follow the old calendar and its origins in God, blah, blah, blah. Okay, these are books. I suppose we need to know something about them. Probably if you're a priest, again, I'm going to talk about this more in a minute. Probably if you're a priest, you have more knowledge to know those kinds of things because people are going to bring questions about that. Okay, but if we don't have a specific reason to be reading one of these books, if we just read it because we think it's interesting, I'm not sure it really helps us very much in our spiritual life is the point. A dogmatic book, I don't think we really need to be reading much dogmatic books either. Maybe that sounds weird for me to say, but our liturgy is great. Our prayers are great. They teach us just about everything we need to know about dogmatics, to be honest. And if there's a specific question that it doesn't teach us, then that's when we can search out a specific book and research that specific question or ask our priest or spiritual father if we need to. And St. John Climacus says this himself. It's interesting. He's talking to solitaries, those who are advanced in the spiritual life, and he even tells them, don't dabble too much in dogmatic books. Don't dabble too much in speculative books. They'll just get you confused, is what he says. And you'll think you're some spiritual giant because you're in these highfalutin theological thoughts. But those are not the same thing as the contemplative life. You can know a ton about dogmatic theology and a ton about speculative theology and not know the slightest thing about the contemplative life and prayer and not have come anywhere close to see the division of God and the divine light.
It's called seminary.
It's sometimes called seminary, and it's sometimes called coffee house. Sometimes coffee houses are a place for that kind of thing. And just conversations that just maybe are really interesting, but they don't help us. I think what I'm trying to urge us is to select our reading based on what will help us get to God, not what will help us answer interesting questions that we find really exciting. Okay, all right. I mean, if you want to compare, the new calendar versus the old calendar versus how do I deal with my lust, or how do I deal with my greed? I think, yeah, well, I could see the one is more interesting, but probably the one how to deal with our passions is probably more helpful to us. That's the point. And so, in general, I think what we want to focus on is we want to focus on the active books that teach us to cultivate the virtues, and throw in a little bit of the contemplative books, especially as we grow more in our spiritual life. Okay. Final thing I want to say is that there is a website called monasticlibrary.org. It is run by the fathers of Holy Cross Monastery, and it lists of books. It has a similar list of books that would be. It's their list of books that they have their novices read.
Holy Cross here?
Holy Cross Monastery here. They used to have a monastic library within their Holy Cross site. They've branched it out into a separate site called monasticlibrary.org. It's the same list, and they've branched it out to a separate site. It's got some other resources on it. I would recommend that. They in particular list some other, like Elder Paisius, Elder Cleopa. They give you some other books that would be good beginners' books. Is the point.
Holy Cross Monastery or Hermitage of the Holy Cross?
It's Hermitage of the Holy Cross. Yeah. They've made a separate domain called monasticlibrary.org. Okay. I want to move on now. That's the question of what spiritual books we read. Now I want to move on to the question of how we apply those spiritual books when we read them. But let me pause and see if there are any questions or comments. About 35 minutes. Thank you.
When you're talking about the books about dogmatic theology, I assume you mean by that things like on the Incarnation, on the Divine Images, those sort of books?
Yes. Examples of books on dogmatic theology would be on the Incarnation by Saint Athanasius, various books by the Cappadocians, Saint Basil the Great, on dealing with dogmatic questions about the specifics of how to formulate the Trinity. One God, three persons, that sort of thing. We need to have some knowledge of that, but I think our knowledge of that needs to be a practical knowledge. If someone comes to us and challenges the Trinity and says the Trinity is nonsense, explain to me why you Christians believe in something so dumb as the Trinity, then you got to be able to defend that in some way. But beyond being able to defend that in some way, I'm not sure we need to go into the details of the procession of the Holy Spirit and the mode by which the procession occurs and how that distinguishes him from the begetting of the Son and how it was eternal. You see what I mean? I mean, it just comes to the point where you think you've reached high spiritual heights by understanding all these intricacies, but you can't pray. Okay, that's the point.
I really appreciate the distinctions that St. John's making that you're drawing out.
Yes.
Different speculative stuff is really pastorally. I can just say, please. I really, if I have a regret pastorally, it's that sometimes early on in my ministry, I encourage some of those conversations just through youthful enthusiasm.
Right.
Not realizing what was happening in people's lives, that I really should be redirecting them toward things like St. Ignatius Branjanino, the Desert Fathers. Instead, we're talking about the debates over icons and how bad the Protestants are because they don't, And it's so easy to read on the Divine Images by St. John Damascus, which is a great book. Read it, but kind of read it not for myself, but as a tool by which I can beat someone else up with, So the challenge for us is, if we're going to read on the Incarnation, maybe we do have a real specific need to digest something and share it with another person, but if we can read that almost as contemplative literature rather than as something dogmatic, there's a way I think you could read something like that for yourself as a way to grow spiritually in a contemplative manner, especially something as basic as on the Incarnation, or maybe not on the images, but there are a number of fathers that might be true for, that would be called dogmatic.
Right.
I think if we read it with a mind not to be polemical, but simply just to grow spiritually, it can be helpful. So our attitude as we approach it is as important as the category.
Right. Father Justin makes the point that, for the recording, Father Justin makes the point that dogmatic books and the attitude that we bring to them is key if we come to them in terms of being polemical, in terms of, for example, to be triumphant and exalted as to how much better Orthodox theology is than Roman Catholic or Protestant theology, then that's not an attitude that's going to help us in the spiritual life. That's going to cultivate pride, I think is the point. And but if we approach it as something that is contemplative, something that maybe gives us a sense of awe as to how great God is, you know, even if you even read it and you say, "Boy, I don't even understand half of this," and if that comment of "I don't understand half of this" leads you to a sense of awe and veneration of God, then it's going to help you in your contemplative life. And it's gonna help you in your active life, because you're going to say, "Wow, this is a God that's so big, I can't even hardly understand him. I better obey him."
And I would add too, I think because a lot of us are coming from a different dogmatic point of view than the Orthodox, to read a little bit of that might be helpful to us, just as we reorient our world. What I found is when I first became Orthodox, I needed to read a lot of those books, not a lot, but some of those books.
Yeah.
But I don't really go to those now.
Yeah.
Now I feel like I have the framework, so I can go back to the ladder,
Right.
and Ignatius, Branchonino, and really. But when I first converted, I read a lot of that, and I don't think it was bad. But
Yeah.
now I don't do much of that. Now I'm back in the Gospels again. But I use on the Incarnation to be able to read the Gospels well.
Right.
I see it differently now because of St. Athanasius.
Right. And
I'm
Father,
going back to square one. I'm not pretending I'm at step 10.
right. And Father Justin makes the point that sometimes when you convert, you need to reboot some of your dogmatic thinking. And so reading some dogmatic works, again, I think in conversation with your spiritual father, what ones you need to read in order to reboot properly to an Orthodox way of thinking, and that then can put you in the proper framework to read these active and contemplative books and to read the Gospels. Again, that's the pinnacle, actually, is to read the Gospels. Let's not ever forget that. Then it's A and Z. Then that can give us the framework to read these properly. Okay, let me. Yes, go ahead.
Because I just thought of an entire category of books, and I don't know which of the four categories. I know some of the four categories it doesn't go into. Saints' lives, hagiography.
Yeah, I think the saints' lives you would lump in as a specific kind of active book, because you're looking at their actions, you're looking at the way they practice the virtues, also the way they practice prayer, but it's an active book in that it gives us an example. That's the point of the saints' lives, is we are to emulate their examples as much as is possible for us. Okay, so St. Ignatius, as I said, turns in chapter 10 of the Arena to answer the question of how to apply spiritual books. And he uses a particular word, discernment or discretion. And basically that's the idea. We have to have a sense of discretion. Remember, St. John in the Ladder talks about this. Obedience and discretion. Obedience and discrimination are the two kind of parallels he gives. And again, maybe that parallel between those two things doesn't make sense right off the bat. But in his chapter on obedience, he says obedience is an abandonment of discernment in a wealth of discernment. So obedience to the commandments of the gospel, in some cases obedience to the commandments of our spiritual father, if it's appropriate for our mode of life. That is laying aside any wisdom or discretion we have. I don't understand anything, so I need to obey instead because I don't understand myself, I don't understand my spiritual life. And the irony is that when we take that step, that's when we begin to actually have discrimination and discretion. And the abandonment of it begins to be a wealth of discernment. And basically, St. Ignatius's answer to the question of how we apply spiritual books is have good discretion when you apply them to your life. Let me also look at a passage from the Ladder. This is from step 4 on obedience. Paragraph 118 through 120. And let me just read a couple passages here, make a few comments on it, and then I want to try to generalize the kinds of questions we could ask ourselves when we go to apply spiritual books. Because I think these set of 3 paragraphs here, step 4, 118 through 120, gives us an example of the kinds of questions we need to be asking ourselves. Okay, 118. The devil suggests to those living in obedience the desire for impossible virtues. Hear that sentence. The devil suggests to those living in obedience, in other words, communal monks who are beginners, he suggests to those living in that state of beginners the desire for impossible virtues. Similarly to those living in stillness, in other words, those who are a little bit more advanced in the spiritual life, he proposes unsuitable ideas. Okay? Now he comes back to those living in obedience. He says, scan the mind of an inexperienced novices and you will find their deluded notions. Scan the mind of inexperienced novices and you will find their deluded notions. Here's what he says, their deluded notions. A desire for stillness, for the strictest fast, for uninterrupted prayer, for absolute freedom from vanity, for unbroken remembrance of death, for continual compunction, for perfect freedom from anger, for deep silence, and for surpassing purity. Now you listen to the way that he said all those things? Yeah, the desire for these things is good. I want to desire complete stillness. I want to desire freedom from passions. I want to desire strict fast. I want to not ever be angry at all. I want to have continual compunction. Those are good things. But if we think that we're going to get these very quickly, right at the beginning of the spiritual life when we're still novices, St. John calls that a deluded notion. This is something that we only come to with ascetic labor, the active life, something that we have to work very likely years or decades for, and maybe we'll start to come close to these things. But notice, this is what's almost more interesting about it. He says, what happens next? When the novice dreams about these, and then he begins to realize maybe he can't have them because it's a deluded notion, then this is what happens. And if, by divine providence, they are without these to start with, listen to what they do next. They leap in vain from one thing to another, having been deceived. For the enemy urges them to seek these perfections prematurely, so that they may not persevere and attain them in due course. So you see the enemy's strategy here? In order to ensure that they never get to them, he tries to encourage them to seek them too early. When they can't seek them too early, then they jump around to something else, right? There's no patience in that. There's no endurance in that. If we would just stay where we're at, doing our work now, where God has placed us, then that's our only chance. That honestly is our only chance of attaining these in due course. Jumping around, so in the life of a monastic, this would look like, oh, I'm not making any spiritual progress at this monastery, so I'm going to transfer to this one. I'm going to transfer to this one. Or I don't like this spiritual father anymore, I want to go to this spiritual father instead, right? Can you see similar things that we might do in the world? It would be along these lines. Well, I don't like this parish anymore. They don't help me spiritually anymore. I'm going to go over here to this parish. You know, or maybe other more subtle things that we could do in our lives. How many times do we jump from one thing to another, having no patience, having no endurance to continue to maybe possibly attain some of these things in due course? To those living in stillness, the deceiver extols hospitality, service, brotherly love, community life, visiting the sick. So this is a similar trick of the devil, but it's slightly different. So remember, those living in stillness are people who their way of life is to be alone, and not to go out and be among people. And being alone, and that asceticism of being alone, is what they have dedicated themselves to. And the devil tempts them to what? Hospitality, service, brotherly love, community life, visiting the sick. So they're going doing the very things that make for what is against their mode of life. Do you see what I'm saying? So we can apply this to ourselves, but we have to tweak it a little bit. And the point is that if we are being tempted to things that are good in and of themselves, but they are things that don't match with our mode of life, whatever our mode of life might be, then it's also going to be something that the devil can tempt us with impatience and tempt us to not persevere on the course that we've been set that is in accord with our mode of life. He goes on in step 119, or paragraph 119 of step 4. Only a few, and it is true what I say, can live in stillness. In fact, only they who have obtained divine consolation for encouragement in their labors and divine cooperation in their struggles. So his point is that solitaries are very few, and they have to have a special gift, and that's a gift that comes only from God in the form of divine consolation and divine cooperation. Now again, we have to tweak this too, but this applies to us as well. There may be some labors that we could undertake ourselves if, and only if, we have the appropriate divine consolation, the appropriate divine cooperation for engaging in that particular struggle. It may not be the same struggle that a solitary has to go and be by himself, but maybe something different that we could engage in that's in accord with our mode of life, that if we have the divine consolation and divine cooperation, then we can engage in it. One more principle that this passage is amazing because it gives us all the principles we need to apply. Paragraph 120. Let us judge the nature of our passions and of our obedience and choose our spiritual father accordingly. If you are prone to lust, then do not select as your trainer a wonder worker who is ready for everyone with a welcome and a meal, but rather an ascetic who will hear of no consolation in food. So, in other words, being strict in food is going to tend to make you able to be strict with your passion of lust. So you need to select a spiritual father who's going to be more strict with you in the very thing that you need in order to deal with your lust, is what he says. If you are haughty, then let him be stern and unyielding and not meek and kindly. Let us not seek for those who have the gift of foreknowledge and foresight. So that might be a really interesting person to have as your spiritual father, someone who can tell the future and see into the souls of men. It might give you a sense of importance or something. I have a great spiritual father, right? But rather, we should seek those who are unquestionably humble and whose character and place of residence corresponds to our malady. So, to summarize that, these are the 5 questions that I think we can ask ourselves when we try to apply spiritual literature to ourselves. Honestly, I think these questions can also be tweaked just a little bit, but they will also work for how we apply the Scripture to our lives as well. Maybe on another time I'll be able to talk about how we would tweak these questions a little bit for applying the Scriptures. But a similar set of questions would be asked. Okay, here are the 5 questions about how to apply spiritual books to ourselves. First of all, what is my mode of life? Okay, am I married? Am I a single person in the world, or am I monastic? Okay. Also, am I a lay person, or am I ordained? Okay. And again, each of those different modes of life are going to require a different way of practicing the virtues, a different way of praying. To give 2 examples, the virtue of hospitality. If there's any virtue that married people or people in the world can exceed monastics in, it is the virtue of hospitality. Yes, monastics are called to hospitality, particularly those in communal and cenobitic settings. But hospitality, and I should add to this almsgiving. Hospitality and almsgiving, giving to the poor, being of assistance to the poor, right? Monastics are supposed to stay in their monastery, right? We're out in the world. And so that gives us an opportunity to show hospitality, which is a specific kind of almsgiving. And that's something where we can exceed monastics as single people living in the world and as married people, okay? So we don't need to think of ourselves as somehow some second class less than. There are ways that we can exceed monastics. And that's one example. And that's something, hospitality, at least in the sense of going out and providing others with hospitality, and in particular almsgiving, that's something that doesn't accord completely with the mode of life of a monastic. But it accords perfectly with the mode of life of living in the world. That's the point. That's the 2 points. 1, they don't go out. They stay in their monastery. And 2, they've relinquished money, and so they don't have as much money to give to people, whereas we in the world have jobs, and that gives us more resources to give to people. That's exactly right. The other example that we could give would be there probably would be some spiritual activities and some spiritual reading that we would need to do as an ordained person that probably we would not need to do as a lay person. I've kind of already mentioned that. Maybe some more dogmatic works, maybe some works that are specifically addressed to how does one be a spiritual father, how does one hear confessions, that sort of thing. That's a different set of writings that you would need to read. The Holy Canons, right, the Holy Canons. Please, okay, that's another thing let's say right now. Please, just don't read the Holy Canons. Okay, you'll just get confused. I promise. They sound interesting, but they're not. First of all, they sound interesting and they're not, if you go read them. And second, they're really boring. You know, this list of, well, when you commit this sin, you should be out of church for 10 years. Okay, it just gets old real quick, okay? Just find something else to read, okay? Second question. How far is my growth in the spiritual life? Okay, St. John Climacus does a fantastic job of this. He will say at points, this is what you should do if you're a beginner. This is what you should do if you're in the middle way. And this is what you should do if you're perfect. And it's three different things. And so maybe other spiritual writers aren't going to be as forthright, or, as explicit about that. But that doesn't mean that there aren't things that are written in these books that are not going to apply to our spiritual state. If we're beginners, then applying things that are for the middle way and the perfect are not going to work. It's going to be counterproductive. Which is another reason not to read the canons. Okay, what are my passions and what are my infirmities? Okay. St. John in various places, particularly when he deals with certain vices, and he gives certain particular kind of advice, and he says, if this is your specific passion, then you should do this. Okay, well again, that's stated obviously. And we just read a passage from that, right? If your passion is lust, then you should have this kind of spiritual father. If your passion is this, then you should have this, right? But again, other writers are not going to be as specific. And maybe what they're writing is they're writing something that is directed towards someone who has a particular struggle with passions and with infirmities. Actually, let me say briefly what the difference between passions and infirmities are. A passion, in general, it's a little more complicated than this, but in general, a passion is something that's going to lead to a voluntary sin, and an infirmity is something that's going to lead to an involuntary sin. It's a little bit more complicated than that because you can do things in your life that would give you infirmities. And so you've made a choice to have a particular infirmity. So you don't take care of yourself and you get sick. Okay? Once you get sick, you're in an infirmity. Okay? But you did make a choice that made you arrive in that infirmity. I hope that makes sense. But the point is that once you are sick, you now can't do anything about it. You're sick. You're stuck with it. And at that point, it's an infirmity. And any sin that you commit as a result of that illness, for example, is going to be it's going to be a sin, but it's going to be an involuntary sin. Okay, so other infirmities might include a lack of certain talents, a lack of a certain knowledge, ignorance, other weaknesses in our character that are not necessarily passions, that sort of thing. Anyway. The point is know thyself. Know what your struggles are, know what your passions are, know what your infirmities are, and apply what you read in spiritual works in a way that's in accord with what your particular struggles are. And then the fifth question that I would ask is, what divine consolation and cooperation do I have? Or do I not have any at all? Okay? So there are certain things that are going to be discussed in spiritual works. Being a solitary is an excellent example. If you do not have a specific divine consolation and divine in-working to be a solitary, don't do it. Just don't do it. But there are other examples as well. For example, maybe you might read in the saints' lives that a particular married couple towards the end of their life decided together to live as brother and sister, and they were not going to have marital relations anymore. Well, that might be something you might decide together if you have a certain The two married people might decide together. I would emphasize that it would need to be decided together. One person shouldn't just go do it by themselves. But also, when the two people decide it together, make sure you're not just doing it out of some inflated zeal, inflated pride. You really need to have a divine consolation and cooperation to undertake that kind of deep ascetic labor. That's the point. And if you're unsure about whether or not you have a particular divine consolation or cooperation to do something, you probably don't. Okay? A divine consolation and cooperation is going to be of a character that is just completely irrefutable. You will know deep down in your soul, all the way to your bones, that this is the gift you're being given to undertake this particular labor. Also, something to do in conversation with your spiritual father. Okay, the point is we've got to have discernment, but that's the problem. That's the very thing we don't have, is discernment. So we've got to play this catch-22 beginner's game of beginning to have discernment. And again, I'll make reference to the passage I read last week. The very first words of the chapter on discernment are, in beginners, discernment is a true knowledge of themselves. So that's what we need to begin with, a true knowledge of ourselves and our passions and our weaknesses and our strengths. And when we begin to have a true vision of ourselves, not our deluded, prideful notions of ourselves as to how great we are, or what a pitiful person we are. Did you know that thinking of yourself as some kind of pitiful person, special, horrible sinner, that's just another kind of pride. It's inverted pride. Okay, so we got to have a true knowledge of ourselves, true discernment, and when we begin to have that, then we can begin to understand how to apply spiritual literature properly. Then we can have a little bit more discernment. Then we can apply spiritual literature a little bit better. Then we can have a little bit more discernment, and it's just this back and forth. And again, I would also emphasize, always do this in conversation with what you read in the Gospels. If in doubt, just put down the spiritual book and pick up the Gospels instead. Gospels, Gospels, Gospels. Okay, I'll pause for any questions or comments, then I'll kind of say some concluding remarks. Yes?
I just appreciate what you said about almost everything you said so far. One thing I would speak about with discernment is, I think for most of us being beginners, God speaks, He gives us discernment through the life situation we're in.
Yes.
So for instance, the question of, do I separate from philosophy or spiritual? Well,
Yes.
If you look at it practically, most of us, whether we're married or single, are going to be spending most of our life in a celibate state. What do I mean? Well, I mean, for the first 20 years of your life, theoretically, you're supposed to be celibate.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, but I'm talking about what we're called to do.
Yeah.
If I'm a married man, I'm taking that as seriously as the monk is.
Yeah.
I'm supposed to be celibate for a large chunk of my young life.
Yes.
My wife gives birth.
Yes.
I mean, you don't have relations for a long time.
Yeah.
Sometimes.
Yes.
And then depending on how strict you keep observing the fasts, and I don't tell anyone, hey, during Lent, never have sex, but there's that tradition in our church that if you can keep it, you try to do it.
Yes.
That kind of thing. And then infirmity and sickness comes along, and you can't force yourself on the other, so you have to be celibate and chaste.
Yes.
And then there's old age.
Yes.
And maybe he wants it, but she can't, or vice versa.
Yes.
I mean, this is pastoral reality, and you know what? That is a way to know that God's calling you to do it. If she's sick or he's sick, so we can lay aside even our quest for discerning God's will and just say, what do I have in front of me? Well, that's God's will for me right now.
Right. That's a very good point. That in some ways discernment isn't rocket science. It's just simply what's in front of me, which comes back to the first question: what is my mode of life? And the second question of mostly the first question: what is my mode of life? In particular, what things are directly in front of me because of my mode of life? What is the situation that's being presented to me? Divine providence comes to us frequently just simply in the situation that is presented to us, and we respond to that situation. The comments about reading dogmatic literature, that's another good example of this. If someone comes to you and says, Trinity doesn't make any sense, I don't get it, explain it to me. Well, that's divine providence to go and read some dogmatic literature so that you can explain it to someone. But unless somebody comes and does that, then it's probably not the most helpful spiritual literature if there's something else you could read instead.
Instead, though, to analogize from what St. John would say,
Yeah.
Instead of seeing God's will and what I'm presented with, I bounce around like a monk looking for a new monastery. And
Right.
trying to recreate these situations but it really is self-will on my part, rather than in my own, particular to my life, right?
Right.
I'm interacting with that reality in a way that would be just like a monk running around trying to find a new spiritual father or a new monastery.
Right.
Same thing, just
Right.
applied to a married man or a married woman.
Right. We're not willing to do the simple thing of just accepting the situation that's placed in front of us. We hop around and try to find some special thing that, well, this applies in this way instead because I'm special and I'm spiritual and I'm an ascetic and I'm Orthodox. Or whatever, yeah. Very good. Any other questions? Audrey, did you have one?
I don't know if this is getting off topic, but at some point in the future, it'd be nice if, like, the church fathers, like especially the really older writings, if there is any way to read them in plainer English. Because I mean, the stuff that's written in the last few hundred years, I mean, I can understand it a lot better the last 100 years or so, but earlier stuff, well, I mean, I understand, like, in the Incarnation, like, perfectly. I mean, that's easy. But, you know, there's some stuff that you come across that it's like,
It's just translation issues.
Some of our translations are older than others, and some of our translations are in need of some updates.
Is the Orthodox Church willing to, at some point, have, like, translations that are, like, very plain English, like, for us right now? Are they willing to do that at some point?
Oh, they're already doing it.
We need to do it.
Oh, right. Well, I kind of knew that on some level.
I mean, those are really accessible
Oh, okay.
words.
Okay.
But it's not impossible for all authors. Some authors are plainer than others.
Yeah, it's not possible for St. Maximus.
Depending on how,
will blow
like,
your head apart.
your,
We have some
I'll fine tune it, right?
St. John Chrysostom at home in a book of those 19 fathers, and like it just some volume.
Translated how
It's
long ago?
and I just it's a bad translation.
It's bad,
Like
yeah.
you don't get anything that's
It's in a
perfect.
King James. It's in a King James sort of
And when
language.
you read the St. Vladimir
A faux
text,
King James. That's right. It's an imitation of King James, which, yeah. Yeah, no. We definitely, and there's a lot of works that haven't been translated at all that we're in need of translating. The Philokalia, honestly, still has a volume that was supposed to come out but hasn't yet. So there's a lot of things that are in need of translation, and so part of what we need to do, and this could be a particular spiritual gift and calling, is learn some languages and start translating them, and get a spiritual father to do it in conversation with, to just kind of as your
Knock it out, Audrey.
as your check, as your check. But yeah, we need that, and it's not just that. There's still a continued need for translation of liturgical text. We don't have everything of that translated either.
Getting close.
So we're getting close, but there's a few things that haven't done it yet. So yeah, we definitely need a translation, and we definitely need translations that are accessible. I think we don't want them in we don't want them in the absolute simplest English, especially if it's something that's intended for liturgical use. There needs to be a certain kind of reverence to it. But I don't think that's what you're saying.
Right.
I think you're just saying something that isn't just total.
Occasionally, I might come across something that I don't understand or something.
Yeah.
Well, even reading St. John Damascus, the Expedition of the Orthodox Faith, like, I understand it, but I'm like, this could be in a little plainer English.
We could.
And which I really wish it was, because I really, like I said, I get it, but I'm part of me is like, this isn't really plain enough in parts. So.
Yeah.
I'd often wish coming to Orthodox, my prayer books weren't even plainer English, because it was even hard just to read out of the Jordanville prayer book.
Right.
It is. There's a certain, and if you think this is hard in English, okay, consider the fact that when a person in Russia comes to the church, they've got a whole, in a sense, it's a related language, and you can kind of get part of it, but in a sense, they've got to make some transitions to things about a new language, Slavonic. Likewise. Liturgical Greek is not just perfectly straightforward for non-Greeks to understand. We call it Greek, but it's really it's Old Greek, and it can be quite.
It's much more difficult to understand the King James
Yes,
And
yes.
same with
It's a more difficult process, and so for us to kind of come to in a King James sort of language, an appropriate, not overly florid, convoluted, faux King James, as Father puts it, but an appropriately translated King James. I think that's good for us because it lifts our spiritual tenor, and prayers that are meant to induce reverence need to be in kind of a language that lifts us up to a higher level. And one of the ways they can do that is kind of use the highest form of a particular language, which in our case is King James.
And Audrey, that he's articulating like Archbishop Dimitri's vision of that. He did a good job expressing Vladika Dimitri's vision.
Okay.
There were
Yeah.
other Orthodox voices like Father Hopko who would disagree, but we can say that, you know.
But at the same time,
unsympathetic to what
but at the
Mike's
same
saying,
time,
because
Father
that's what
Hop,
I came into the church with
but at
was
the same
Vladika.
time, Father Hopko would not say put everything in something that a third grader can
No,
read.
He wouldn't say make Hemingway our church.
Yeah. It's not something. So even Father Hopko, while he would probably take out the these and thous, he would still want a kind of a dignified way of speaking, I would say. So I think it's just a specific disagreement about a few grammatical things of these and thous and a few other things like that. Yeah, I think everybody agrees we need a dignified way of speaking in liturgy. And our spiritual books, I think, maybe should mirror that in a sense of having a dignified way of speaking. But a totally convoluted way of speaking that just is next to gibberish, that's not good either.
Sometimes you get the dignified feel without it necessarily being the language. There's, like, I know I've read some things that just, that's just present in it because of how the writer
Yeah.
approached it.
Right.
And you don't necessarily need these and thous to lift it up.
And I think there's a few particular words. Like most of us, I don't think use the word condescend in everyday language, or God deign to do for our salvation, right? Right. But certain particular words. But so there's a little bit of a new vocabulary you have to learn.
I had a professor at St. Tikhon's who was Russian, and he said, we have many literate people who know English well. We have many people that know Slavonic well and Greek well. But we don't have any people who are poets in both Slavonic and Greek and in English.
That's the problem.
That's the challenge. And so,
Yeah.
we're looking at over the next 200 years. I'm sure our liturgical text will develop.
Right.
Just a little patience. Oh, I don't know.
So let me make a few concluding comments, and then we can be dismissed for the evening. First thing I want to say is I want you to be encouraged, not discouraged, by this talk. Okay, take it in a way, a positive way of encouragement. Yes, there are some spiritual works that probably most of us don't need to be reading. If you have any doubt about what you need to be reading, that's the time to go and speak to your priest or your spiritual father. Okay, but in general, I would like for us to be encouraged to engage in spiritual reading, and encouraged in particular that we can take these spiritual works and we can apply them to our lives, and we can gain discernment, and we can gain spiritual maturity, and we can move closer to the eventual goal of the divine vision of Jesus Christ himself. So these words of caution that I've been issuing here, I hope you will take as a word of encouragement of don't go down the wrong path, take this path instead of thinking that there is no path for you to take at all. I think there is a path, and I hope I've done a fairly decent job of pointing that out, and I hope the 5 questions that I gave will help you with that. Another thing, if you're reading a particular spiritual book and there's just some passage that you just don't get, don't obsess about it. Don't go, I got to understand this. Just pass over it and move on. It's okay. You don't have to understand everything. And there's always going to be something in every spiritual book that maybe you don't understand. There's very different reasons why you might not understand it, but don't worry about it. Okay, it's okay. Just move on to the next thing. If you find yourself continually not understanding anything, then maybe it might be time to switch to a different book or go talk to your spiritual father or something like that. But just one passage here and there, and then you continue on, and you generally understand everything. Just don't worry about it. Finally, I want to read a passage from chapter 9 of the Ladder. There is nothing to prevent a person from living according to the commandments of the gospel in any monastery. And I would substitute that in any parish, in any mode of life, in any situation that you find yourself. There's nothing to prevent a person from living in accordance to the commandments of the gospel in any way, whatever may be the rule of that monastery, however far that monastery may be from well ordered. So even there's nothing to prevent us from living according to the gospel commandments, even in a parish that is a total disaster, and the priest isn't any good, and the priest isn't any good, and we can't even find a spiritual father who's good enough for us because we're so good, and we can't find any spiritually like-minded people to talk with us and encourage us. Even in that situation, there's nothing to prevent us from living according to the commandments of the gospel. This is said to encourage and to set at rest those who are not satisfied with the running of their monastery, whether rightfully or wrongfully. Likewise, this is said to encourage us that if you're not satisfied with the way things are in your life situation right now, with the parish you find yourself at, with the mode of life that you find yourself in, don't let that cause you to just hop around without discernment and look for something new. Be patient. Stay where you're at. Only move to a new mode of life and a new place after great consideration. Stick where you're at. That's the providence of God for you. And even in that situation, there's nothing to prevent you from keeping the gospel commandments. And that is, in other words, there's nothing to prevent you from being a good Christian where you're at. Okay. Let's say our final prayers, and then if anybody wants to stick around and answer more questions, I'll be happy to do that.